Hello, back again, dear students. In this chapter, we will discuss basic questions about the mechanics of facial development. The early face is characterized by bulges, furrows, and wrinkles. We want to observe how this develops into a face that we know. The early face is characterized by bulges, furrows, and wrinkles. We want to follow how the face that we are familiar with develops from these. From the bulges, we can identify the pharyngeal arches or visceral arches, from which essential parts of the face do arise. And only because, during further development, the face straightens up, because space is created in the oronasal cavity, only because of this are further developments possible, like, for example, the formation of the palate and the downward displacement of the tongue. We will also talk about the development of the lips, and in this context also about the pathomorphogenesis of oral cleft formations. We will continue with the formation of the facial skeleton, at first cartilage and then bone, and finally we will only touch the development of the temporomandibular joint as an attachment joint, to name just a few highlights of this lecture. And thereby, it is always fascinating to see how, with each embryonic development, always again a human face emerges, which always looks typically human, and however, so different that we can distinguish and recognize ourselves individually on the basis of the faces. As general learning objectives, or as the main topics, I would like to point out the consequences of how facial development is to be understood as a consequence of the curved overall body shape of the embryo. We want to identify the visceral arches and their contents as to how they contribute to the components of the face during development. And of course, whenever possible, I will give you clinical hints why all this is so important to know. Surprisingly, little importance is given to the embryonic development of the face in the learning objectives catalogs of medicine and dentistry in some countries, I know. Yet it is important to understand the prenatal relationships, if possible even causal, as far as we know. For me, this is always a key to understanding malformations, but also the normal structure and also anatomy itself becomes explainable for me this way. Nevertheless, the literature is not very rich, especially when it comes to the face directly. So I can recommend at least the textbooks of Jeffrey Sperber, the Canadian embryologist. And those of you who really want to do it, you will find answers to basic information about the mechanics of embryonic development in the works of Erich Blechschmidt. And the general textbook Human Embryology by Klaus Hinrichsen is very comprehensive and general processes are well presented. But you will find not in-depth information about the face in there. And the atlas by Gerd Steding, on the other hand, contains many scanning electron microscopic images of also embryonic faces, but little text which could be helpful for explanation. And well, in the end, all the contents which I address in this lecture you can find in the pictures and in the words in my textbook, Oral Structure and Biology. That is why I always give the page numbers on the upper left corner. This is going to be an extensive lecture, as you can see here in the overview. The mechanics of facial development leads at first to the formation of the pharyngeal arches. And then the common oronasal cavity can only be separated by the palate into a nasal and into an oral cavity when there has been created enough space for this event. And the processes of cleft formation are different for the lips and for the palate. You will be able to understand that from the context of the overall development. And we will then talk about cartilage and bone formation, the dynamics of the alveolar process bone, and the formation of the muscles and the tongue. And the cranial nerves must not be missing. And finally, we just touch the formation of the temporomandibular joint as an attachment joint. Details about that process will be covered in depth in another special lecture on the temporomandibular joint. For me, ultimately, facial development can only be understood if we assume the forward bending of the total body of the embryo as a prerequisite. On the left side, you can see an embryo of 5 mm crown rump length, 26 days old. It's a scanning electron micrograph. It is clearly curved. The head is bent forward so much that the forehead is in contact with the primordium of the heart. For orientation, I have labeled the eye and also some other structures, as there are these 3 larger flexural folds labeled as maxillary bulge and the first and the second visceral arches. We will talk about all that, how these bulges will create a face eventually. But first, these bulges are important. The embryo is strongly curved at first. And how does this happen and what are the consequences? And in later development, as you see on the right side, there is a fetus 40 mm crown rump length, and the forehead is now far away from the heart, and the body has straightened up properly. This change in form and proportion is also one of the basic prerequisites for formation of the palate, which then leads to the separation of the previously common oronasal cavity. We will talk about that also. Now, let us take a look at the face. In the photograph on the left, which is from one of Erich Blechschmidt's works, you can see the bulge formation of the face. The face actually is made up from these horizontal bulges, actually a series of these high and low profiles. Some authors talk about facial processes, but that goes back to a mistake. They thought that in the deep shadows everything would be hollow and it goes endlessly into the depth, and the face would then grow together from the processes. But this is not the case. In the deep furrows on the ground, there is still compact epithelium. It continues further down. So we have folds around bulges next to each other, and in the depth of the furrows, these bulges are connected. They are connected to each other. That is something fundamentally different. And why do we have this specific pattern of high and low profiles? This is a consequence of the living actions of all the cells involved. It's biokinetics. All cells grow, everything expands. But the head cannot grow in a uniform way to all directions equally like a balloon. No, we observe that the brain grows at first much faster than anything else. And that way the head is bent forward. The growing brain pushes from above, and from below the heart enlarges rapidly. And this is meant to be indicated by the red arrows in the scheme on the right side of the picture. And in between, these bulges arise, preferably in a horizontal direction. This is quite comparable to the high relief of the Earth's surface. The tectonics of the Alps in Europe can be seen as a manifestation of the pressure from the north and from the south against each other, and as a consequence the Alps do rise up and run preferably in a horizontal direction. Or take the Rocky Mountains. They are an expression of the shift of the whole country in direction to the west. The dynamics in the face is even more dramatic. In this embryo, a scanning electron microscopical image taken by Klaus Hinrichsen, and by the way, Also, he was a former graduate student of Erich Blechschmidt. So in this embryo, which is 6 weeks of age, there is no mouth at all yet. What we see here so directly, that is, we are way back in the later pharynx. There are no cheeks yet, no tongue, no palate, no lips, and everything is still open. And then we see these dark depressions on the right and on the left, surrounded by bulging borders. These are the primordial formations of the nose. Still far apart are the nasal pits. These are epithelial thickenings slightly sunken in. They will later become the nostrils. Around it are the lateral and the medial nasal bulges. And further labeled are the maxillary bulges on either side, which will become the maxilla one day. But both bulges are still far apart on the right and on the left. And further down there is the mandibular bulge, which will eventually become the lower jaw. And only 1 week later, the situation has drastically changed. The two nasal entrances have clearly come closer together now. And what appears so black in the depth is not yet the nostril. It is not yet open, not like a pipe. Initially, the nostrils consist of densely packed compact epithelium which sinks into the depth. So, in the scaling electron microscope, if we were to move closer down into this shadow, we would still find a bottom of solid epithelium in the depth, not yet any opening. Only later, the epithelium will tear up and then the nostrils lined by epithelium will eventually be formed. And the maxillary bulges did come further medially, and a part of the upper lip has already formed by now. I want to point out here that, again, the principle of high and low profile, in other words bulges and folds, is realized, also in the lip. The upper lip shows here these notches. Normally, these notches will disappear and the epithelium becomes smooth again, so that nothing like that can be seen later. But attention, these notches, they can become the onset of a cleft lip if the epithelium will not be smoothened out here again. So it is not a cleft right now, it is just a little notch in the lip contour, and on the bottom of the notch there is still epithelium. And underneath the epithelium there is, of course, mesenchymal connective tissue. And normally this is so voluminous and also strong enough and expands and contributes to the epithelial notch to stretch out in a few days, and the lip will form the normal way. But only then, if the connective tissue underneath is metabolically deficient for some reason, the epithelium could gain the upper hand and sink further into the depth as it continues to grow. And then the notch becomes deeper and deeper. And the same happens from the opposite side of the lip. And then a cleft lip would have developed. I will address this later again a bit in comparison to the palate formation. For now, let us keep in mind, the upper lip can have a notched outline which normally becomes flat, even, and smoothed out again after during the further development. Only in the pathological case, a deepened notch can develop here, which becomes deeper and deeper and separates the underlying mesenchyme also. And thus, a cleft lift results from separation of tissue parts that were previously together and continuous, so to say. And the lower lip has also now developed, and also its outline is a bit wavy. And what is actually the motor for this development? On one hand, the cells grow, they multiply incredibly fast. In addition, however, the brain also continues to grow. It now pushes not only from above, but also from the sides. It pushes the whole midface together, so that is why the nasal entrances come closer together. And now it is also clear why the notches in the upper lip that we have just mentioned do run vertically. And the black space, that is the oral cavity, still a common oral nasal cavity. And only very few days later, the upper lip and the lower lip have smoothened out, and together they form a very nice mouth fold. And see, the mouth even has the correct widths also. The corners of the mouth match with the position of the eyes, which have also migrated more toward the front of the face. Well, actually, they have been pushed there, just as the nose holes have been pushed together. You can also see that they run clearly vertical now, as little slits. And you see, even at such a still picture that is only a snapshot, you see traces of dynamics. And this is similar to a photo of a windsurfer riding the waves. You could see the dynamics there also, even it's a still picture. We can see real dynamics, real movement in this movie, a simulation I got from Mary Watt. The individual parts of the face are colored, and you can see very nicely how the two pink colored parts of the maxillary bulge come together from the right and from the left, and the nose is pushed together and the eyes come into view forward. Now, this is not a human. The eyes are not coming that far forward. It's a rabbit embryo as far as I remember. Now it becomes a bit schematic again. We can now talk about the visceral arches. These flexural folds occur in all mammalian embryos on a regular basis, and they are also called pharyngeal arches. Another name for the same formation is branchial arches. But note, you will still sometimes find the term gill arches in the literature. To me this is puzzling because mammals never develop gills. You know that. This term goes back to the so-called biogenetic law of recapitulation by Ernst Haeckel, which turned out to be not only wrong and disproved, but also a fake. I have already explained this in chapter 4 of this series. I have drawn here only the first 4 pharyngeal arches. There are altogether 6 of them, and the lowest 2 are without further meaning for our topic here. So, from the first pharyngeal arch, or visceral arch, large parts of the face do form in the region of the mandible. And this is why it is also called the mandibular arch. In the center of this bulging arch, Meckel's cartilage is forming, which is a right-left paired cartilaginous brace that runs from the chin region to the middle ear. I will explain later how and why this is formed. Now let's first discuss the schematic matters. This first pharyngeal arch gives rise to everything that is shown in blue in the diagram, including the 2 ossicles of the middle ear, the malleus and the incus. The incus, that is the posterior end of Meckel's cartilage. This still plays an important role in the development of the temporomandibular joint. More about this later, a little at the very end of this lecture, and in more detail in the special chapter on the temporomandibular joint. There are even more structures which arise from the pharyngeal arches. So in every pharyngeal arch, a cartilaginous skeletal part develops. In some places also bone, and in any case a nerve is growing in there, a cranial nerve, and there are soft tissue components, muscles, vessels, and connective tissue. So, to the first visceral arch, there belongs Meckel's cartilage, the mandible, which develops laterally of it, and the nerve of the first pharyngeal arch is the mandibular nerve. That is the lowest branch of the trigeminal nerve, the 5th cranial nerve, plus its accompanying vessels and the regional muscles of mastication and further connective tissue. And below this we find the second pharyngeal arch. It is somewhat smaller. In any case, the first one becomes larger and larger, so that the second one remains smaller. So again, there is a cartilage formation, from which the smaller horn of the hyoid bone emerges. Further in the back, there is the styloid process and the stapes as the 3rd auditory ossicle. So you see, the chain of these ossicles is created by 2 different adjacent visceral arches. The nerve assigned here is the 7th cranial nerve, the facial nerve. It innervates the muscles of facial expression. And there are really people who assume that all of these muscles for facial expression arise from the connective tissue material of the second pharyngeal arch. They assume that this kind of musculature then moves up from down there, up to the face and spreads out there under the skin, over the cheeks, up to the forehead. Well, in the embryo, we do not see any of those muscles moving from down there, from the second visceral arch, up all over the face during embryonic development. This is just another example of how much the thoughts of evolution biology seem to resonate over the description of the developmental processes in the embryo, without asking how exactly this should happen. So, the facial nerve is that cranial nerve which is assigned to the second visceral arch, and the muscles of facial expression which are innervated by it, therefore also sort of are assigned to the second visceral arch. But why these muscles of facial expression should migrate from below there over the whole face in the developing embryo, that is incomprehensible from the point of view of an embryologist. In the theory of evolution, it is described that the muscles of facial expression should have migrated from down there into the face in the course of the history of species. Proven or not, in the embryo, this is not the case. And from the third pharyngeal arch, there arises the lower horn of the hyoid bone, so everything is nicely arranged from cranial to caudal. The associated cranial nerve is the ninth glossopharyngeal nerve. It is easy to remember from this name that connective tissue parts of the tongue and the pharynx arise from the third pharyngeal arch. And also the stylopharyngeus muscle is innervated from this ninth cranial nerve. And the fourth visceral arch gives rise primarily to the upper part of the larynx and the associated musculature. The nerve for this would be the recurrent laryngeal nerve, a branch of the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve. And as I said, the 5th and the 6th arches are not part of the facial region, so we will leave them out here. We have not spoken about the upper jaw yet. It does not belong to the systematics of the visceral arches, although it also arises from a right and a left bulge. But both of them are pushed together, and the upper jaw is formed within, which is still recognizable as a paired bone for a long time, and the nasal capsule is made up of cartilage, and if you like, it also has its own nerve, the maxillary nerve. It comes as a second branch from the trigeminal nerve. And at this point, some clinical hints. Quite a number of the malformation syndromes in the oral and maxillofacial regions are due to developmental disorders that can be assigned to individual visceral arches. For example, malformations in the first visceral arch, for example, the Franceschetti syndrome, often involve the mandible and the auditory system. And syndromes of this type need not to be limited to one visceral arch. They may extend across multiple visceral arches. In any case, the visceral arches may give some diagnostic clues as to the origin of the malformation and which organ systems may be together affected based on their arrangement and on the association of the facial parts and organs that arise within them. It is always good to have that in mind. And another hint. If the folds between individual visceral arches in the neck region become too deep and instead of filling up with mesenchymal tissue become deeper and deeper from the outside and also from the inside, then this may be a reason for the formation or malformation of a lateral neck fistula. We are now in the 7th week of development. The embryo has grown to a crown rump length of 21 millimeters. Now, what is going to happen in these visceral arches during further development? Let us first take the visceral arch number 1 as an example. This, by the way, is a classical prime example of the relationship between external form and internal structure. It is now by the mechanics, which have been discussed in detail up to here, that a well-recognizable bulge has developed, the first pharyngeal arch, or here more concretely, the mandibular bulge. People may also call it the prominence. What happens inside now? If you were one of the hundreds of thousands of cells, where would you like to be? In the middle as a mesenchymal cell, or would you rather like to be in the side? Think of the overcrowded subways in Berlin at the rush hour or some other capital area. What I mean to say is, every cell has a location that is typical for it, and thus an environment that is typical for it also. How does it come about that the cartilage brace develops exactly in the center of this bulge, which is exactly a representation of the bulge but just in the center? I hear again some people say, well, this must develop now in such a way because Meckel's cartilage is the preform of the mandible and this needs a framework, and for this the cartilage serves and therefore it has to develop that way. Well, I want to know for physiological reasons why Meckel's cartilage develops exactly here and exactly in this form. So it is a metabolic changes, and associated with this are also gene activities of the mesenchymal cells exactly in the center of the first vistral arch, along this longish extended center zone. Further outside, it is already completely different. So that is what's happening to the cells exactly in the center of this bulge. That is leading to the formation of the cartilaginous brace. At this time, the cells are still being nourished by diffusion. And the mesenchymal cells, which are located further out in the bulge, in other words, near the epithelium, maybe they are doing better than the cells in the center of the bulge because obviously of their better nutritional situation. In the center, all the metabolic end products of the neighbors do arrive, and further growth of the outer mesenchymal cells leads more and more to the compaction of the mesenchymal tissue in the center of the bulge. So the cells here in the center are in a completely different metabolic situation, and they may react to it, and they look up in their genetic code, oh, what can we do now? Oh yes, in such a situation we have to differentiate to pre-chondroblasts. So that only applies here to the cells in the center of the bulge, and these cells now develop a high osmotic pressure because their intracellular metabolic products have a much higher molecular weight than those in the surrounding area. And as a result, extracellular tissue fluid is attracted, and the cells continue to develop into these rounded, swelling chondrocytes, and thus Meckel's cartilage is formed inside the first vistral arch. This cartilage formation is a result of the mechanics of facial development with this bulge formation. Incidentally, the same happens in the region of the nose, where the cartilaginous nasal capsule is formed under similar circumstances. In this phase of development, the cartilage now takes over the active role. It grows, it really swells and leads to expansion of the cartilaginous structures. In the upper jaw, this is the nasal capsule, which grows in vertical, sagittal and transverse directions. And in the lower jaw, it is the Meckel's cartilage, which grows mainly along its longitudinal axis. And this expansion, this growth with these swelling cells, can also be seen very nicely in a histological section. MC is the label for Meckel's cartilage here, and it pushes upwards, and the dynamics can even be seen in the fact that the mesenchymal cells are pushed away and flattened above it, like the water in a moving ship at the bow. And now here, there is a very important insight in this context. We remember the expanding brain has compressed the facial region at its front. As a result, cartilaginous zones have developed at the specific locations marked in blue here in the scheme. You can identify from top to bottom, as there are the nasal capsule, Meckel's cartilage, and then the primordia of the larynx and also the spine, at that time also still cartilaginous. So under the compression, the cartilage was formed. And now mechanics are reversed. The cartilage cells swell and expand in those directions which are dictated by its shape. I find this incredibly exciting. The conditions for the formation of the cartilage, which were originally compression, have now reversed and lead to an expansion of the face in vertical, sagittal and transversal direction. And similar processes are also observed in the formation of the cartilage braces in the second and in the third visceral arches, as well as in the base of the skull. These processes of cartilage formation take place when the embryo is 5 to 6 weeks old, and the regions where cartilage forms are characterized at the molecular level by the expression of SOX9. And due to the expansional growth of cartilage, there is a rapid growth of the facial region in vertical, sagittal and transverse directions. And at the mechanics of cartilage has another effect. The mesenchyme adjacent to the expanding cartilage differentiates into bone in specific regions. We will discuss that in a few minutes. So up to this point, we have now been able to follow what the very early face looks like when it does not yet have any oral cavity, which was in the 6th week. In that context, we have also mentioned that the nostrils come closer to the middle. And well, that was not quite correct, because we left one aspect out of sight, the enormous growth at that time. I will show you a face of an older embryo from the 12th week now in the same scale. And then you see that the nostrils have sort of moved even closer together than in the small image of the much younger embryo above. But we also have to keep the changes in proportion in mind, which also take place during growth. So actually, the nostrils are even further apart, and the whole face of the younger embryo will even fit in between. This picture of the 12-week-old embryo was hanging above the lintel of my room in the embryology department in Göttingen for many years. Gerd Steding has taken the image and explained me a lot of these details. You can see the hands as they lie on the thick heart. This is just visible at the lower edge at the margin of the picture. And the eyelids are still open. Here the epithelium has made a fold, and you can imagine if it continues to grow from above and from below, then the eyelids will meet from above and from below, and thus the eyelid gap will be created. And by the way, this kind of growth will continue throughout life. Take a look in the mirror, and at some point we have much more eyelid skin than we actually would need to cover the eye. Another aspect that is even more important. Look where the thumbs of this embryo are. Both thumbs are sticking in the oral cavity that has just been formed. And since there is not that much space in the womb anyway, the hands are resting on that voluminous belly, and the lips and the cheeks and also the tongue did just grow around the thumbs in the mouth. No wonder that this way a tight relationship between the thumbs and the oral cavity is established and burned into the brain of this developing individual. Fetuses have been watched to intensively suck their thumbs, and so it is really quite normal that babies and infants just continue with this habit, just as usual. And another thing, we now see an embryo from the 12th week. The 12th week is the transition from the embryonic period to the fetal period. In the fetus, everything is actually already formed. It then only does grow further, so it becomes larger. Yes, the palate is already completely closed. Up to this point, we have been able to follow the development quite linear, stage after stage, as the embryo develops. In the next section of the lecture on prenatal facial development, we will not be able to go on linearly in one direction only, but we also have to go back a little bit in the development every now and then, because we still have to look at some processes that we have not yet discussed. So pay attention to the timings so you always know when that is taking place, that what we are discussing. We will go back now, and it is about the oronasal cavity, about palate formation, about bone formation, muscle formation, and at that end there will be a first glance about the temporomandibular joint also. So now we are back in the 6th week of development. In the left picture there is a scaling electron microscopical image of the face, and the red line indicates the location of the perimedial sagittal section in the picture on the right. There you see the tongue is far up. There is no palate yet, so no separation of the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. At that time we still have a common oronasal cavity. And so at that time, the tongue can still move around in the nasal cavity, touch and do the cleaning up of everything. Let us go through the details. I have labeled T, that's where the tongue is. MC is Meckel's cartilage, M is the mandible, PP is the so-called primary palate. We will see what that is in a moment when we will talk about the palate. And just behind the lips, the dental lamina are recognizable, labeled as DL. In the upper and the lower jaw, and the upper lip is recognizable as UL, and the reference line at N points to the nasal entrance. And you see here the nostril is still plugged with densely packed epithelial cells. The nostril, the typically open canal, will only be formed later when the epithelium, which completely filled the duct, will tear up in the center. Then it will become permeable, and then eventually it will line the wall of the nasal entrance, and this will take a while though. Now let us have a closer look at the development of the oronasal cavity here now in the frontal section. And at the bottom I have added a full face for comparison taken from the atlas by Leonard Nielsen. Again, a lot of mechanics can be seen. So the oronasal cavity is lined by epithelium. This epithelium grows as the cell number increases enormously. And where is the expanding epithelial lining of this cavity going to go? And what does it do if it keeps getting bigger and bigger? Yes, the epithelium is growing so fast that it is expanding faster than the volume of the oronasal cavity itself. And there is only one consequence left. It creates folds. So it is folding up and folding in depending on the location and on the initial conditions. And yes, here is the first shallow elevation at the floor of the mouth. That is the primordium of the tongue. And with a little imagination, or you just believe me, here in the kink there are the folds which will create the palatine processes as they continue to grow. And yes, in this case, the lateral palatine processes are called really processes. When we check this out 2 weeks later, then we can see how far the palatine processes did grow further. And from above, there is the nasal septum coming down. And also, the tongue has gained in size, volume, and height. There are also invaginations of the epithelium at other places, as there are the dental lamina and as there are the salivary glands. Both are epithelial invaginations which develop further in the depth of the mesenchyme, and both palatine processes are still located on either side of the tongue. If you look at the color photographs below the histological sections, you will see that the face has straightened somewhat. We have already seen how this works mechanically. The expansion of Meckel's cartilage and the nasal capsule contribute significantly to this process. This is a basic prerequisite for creating enough space in the oronasal cavity for the tongue to descend and for the two lateral palatal processes to come together in the middle above it. Further downgrowth of the nasal septum and growth of the palatal processes toward the middle enables them to join, but of course only then when the tongue is pulled out of the way. And indeed, the vertical enlargement of the face, and also the straightening of the head and the extension of the cervical spine take care of that. These are all developmental movements. They are all interlaced and connected somehow. Here in this video, it is simulated, which I also received from Mary Watt from Glasgow. So you can see very nicely how the tongue is pulled down and the two lateral palatal processes, which in the meantime have become long enough next to the tongue, bang upwards. They are actually very elastic. Mark Ferguson from Manchester showed that to me on an alligator embryo. You can touch them with tweezers and deflect them, and they always bounce upwards again and again. Then they just have to grow together when they have met in the middle. However, it's not so easy to understand how that is supposed to work. After all, they are all covered with epithelium. And if you press your two fingers together like this, or bind them together with a plaster, will they then grow together? Well, a lot more has to happen there. Some people believe there is then a programmed cell death of the epithelial cells at the fusion site. Others suspect, or even show, an epithelial mesenchymal transformation, a very unusual process for epithelial cells to give up their character. So I don't know. I'd rather like to tell you things in this lecture that I really do know. And why the two palatal processes grow together in the middle, I don't know. In many histological sections, I have also seen in the fusion region still many enclosed epithelial cells that have joined together to form pearl-like structures. And another hint. Growth and expansion of the epithelium lining the nasal cavity goes on and on. This has also led to the undulating upheaval of the nasal concha. And in the uppermost edge of the uppermost conch, that is where the epithelium later in the infancy starts to grow laterally into the maxilla and forms the maxillary sinus. So at first it is as small as a pea, and then the maxilla is literally hollowed out by the ingrowing epithelium. The maxillary sinuses become larger and larger, and the ingrowing epithelium displaces the bone further and further. And this whole process does not have any purpose at all. Although, here again, you can often read that the maxillary sinuses have the purpose of reducing the weight of the head. Some other authors even write that they serve as a buoyancy aid. Well, I find this pretty absurd. Let us rather have a look at this sequence of pictures. These are the two pictures from the Atlas of Erich Blechschmidt, and here he has exposed the two lateral palatine processes. And that way you can maybe better understand my schematic drawings underneath. So at first, the oronasal cavity is fully open. There are only small protrusions, which are the central, or also called the middle or primary palatal process, and then on either side the lateral or secondary palatal processes. And in the center, from the top, there is the nasal septum coming down. And fusion now occurs from front to back, almost like a zipper. It starts towards the end of the 6th week, and by the end of the 12th week, the fusion is also closed all the way back to the uvula. And at this point, another note is interesting. In some textbooks, you might come across the assumption that the fusion site between the anterior and the lateral palatal processes represents the incisive foramen at the palate. This is, of course, not true, because then all blood vessels and all the nerves running through this incisive foramen would have to have been dangling around somewhere freely in the oronasal cavity before the palate is about to be formed. The truth is that the incisive foramen has been present all along and runs in the anterior, the primary palate. The suture just behind it has nothing to do with that foramen. So We were able to examine this more closely and to publish it as a part of the doctoral thesis by Stephanie Emmerich. According to what we have said so far, we can now distinguish the pathomorphogenesis of cleft lip and cleft palate. We have seen that at times the lips show these vertical notches that must smoothen out again. And for this, the mesenchyme must proliferate well under the notched epithelium. And if a cleft lip occurs here, the lip, which has actually always been continuous, is separated. And the mesenchyme under the lip's notch can be divided more and more by the ingrowing epithelium. And just to make that clear again, the lips are not formed by any putative fusion of processes, but they are continuous from the beginning on. And thus, a cleft lip, if it occurs, is the result of a separation of the lip which has been together. And the expression can be variable, up to the discontinuity of the alveolar process, then it's a cleft jaw also. And then the lateral incisors may also be affected to variable degrees, and it can be unilaterally or even bilaterally. And completely different is the formation of the palate. And here, three parts actually really have to grow together. And if this does not occur, then a cleft palate will remain. And the expression can be also variable. Everything that runs along the red lines at C does normally fuse, but it also may remain open. And from the expression of the pathologically cleft situation, you can conclude approximately the timing of the defect, as the palate normally is zipped together from front to back. We have already talked about the cartilaginous facial skeleton earlier in this lecture. That was important for the dynamics of the elevation of the face. Now we want to dedicate ourselves to the emergence of the mandible, which arises now also again in a special way. Almost everywhere in the body, especially in the subcranial skeleton, each bone is first created as a cartilaginous preform, which only then transforms to bone through the process of chondral ossification. On the head, this is also the case for some bones, especially at the skull base. But the mandible, also the maxilla, and especially also the cranial calvaria bones, which cover the brain, develop from the connective tissue directly. And this process is called desmal ossification. How does this work and what is the cause? It is shearing forces. If osteogenic connective tissue comes into the sphere of influence of shearing forces, then bone develops there in a desmal pattern, without a cartilaginous precursor. The mandible is a prime example of this. We remember how Meckel's cartilage was formed, and that because it consists of cartilage, it develops an impressive dynamic action. And due to its expansion, it acts on the surrounding connective tissue, pushes forward and produces this bow wave-like evasion of the mesenchymal cells. We have already seen this earlier. And next to this, there are regions of shearing forces or region of detraction forces. And directly in this region, you see the onset of mandibular bone formation. And the same principle applies to the first bone formations of the maxilla. Under the influence of these developmental movements during shearing forces, or in other words, detraction, which occurs locally, the mesenchymal cells in this region differentiate into osteoblasts and produce bone matrix. The signaling protein, RUNX2, is also found to be a main regulator there. However, we had previously also shown in the lecture on From Gene to Body Form that bone formation is not exactly congruent with the extent of the areas in which RUNX2 is expressed. Bone formation to the side of Meckel's cartilage continues to expand. We have studied this in detail over many years. Here we take as an example a 3D reconstruction of a human embryo from the 7th or the 8th week. if we digitally make the facial skin transparent, we can even see underneath, or we can just take it away completely. And then we see the developmental status of the mandible next to Meckel's cartilage. The maxilla is also already visible next to the nasal capsule. And the different size ratios at that time are also interesting. The semicircular canals in the petrous bone are still as much extended as the trigeminal ganglion or the eyeball. And of course, this is different in childhood and even more different in adulthood. We can also look at this reconstruction again by setting it in motion. Pay attention to the positional relationships of the anatomical structures that you all know by now, and which are already present here in the embryo of this 19 mm crown rump length. That is, as I said, 7th to 8th week. The extension of the mandible on either side next to Meckel's cartilage progresses, and at its dorsal end from the 11th week onwards, there are then also the primordia of the condylar processes and those of the coronal processes visible. And it is also interesting that inside of the condylar processes at certain times a cartilaginous center can be found, which is shown in turquoise in this sequence of images. It is also called secondary cartilage. We may also find this in the coronal process, however, not as pronounced. It is also very impressive in a dorsal view. What I also find so beautiful is how at the dorsal end of Meckel's cartilage you can see the malleus with its handle, which will eventually be the most lateral part of the 3 auditory ossicles. As an example, I have circled only one of the many here. The hammer handle can be seen later in otoscopy, as it then lies against the eardrum from the inside and represents the beginning of the sound conduction chain. The beginnings can already be seen here. At this point we can pause for a moment and summarize the cartilaginous zones in the mandible again. You will soon see that it is not true what has been written in some of the textbooks for more than 100 years, that the mandible ossifies purely in a descendant pattern. On the left we see a mandible from the 12th week, and in the middle only a right half of a mandible from the 14th week in a cranial view, and on the far right there are 2 histological images which I will discuss in more detail in a moment. So we see Meckel's cartilage, which has been present earlier before bone is being formed. There we see cartilaginous centers in the condyla and in the coronal processes. This was all known for a long time, and it was also always described in this way. And at the same time, the description of the ossification has also been dodged, how this takes place exactly. At some point, Meckel's cartilage and the carrot-shaped cartilaginous zones in the processes somehow disappeared or were degraded. After all, they ossified. And here in the front, that could also be remnants of Meckel's cartilage in the chin area, they're also kind of being broken down somehow right now. But there has never been any talk of other cartilage zones independently of those. And then within the framework of our cooperation with the University of Turku in Finland, we also studied the histological collection of Kalevi Koski. Here his successor, Christina Heikenhammer. And then investigating the sections, we found additional cartilaginous centers in the developing mandible, preferably in the gussets between the dental primordia. They are present for a certain period of time, and we have been able to track them back up to the 28th week. In no case they are connected or a part of Meckel's cartilage. They are just too far away from it. They do lie too far lateral of the dental primordia. So if you are ever presented with a multiple choice exam that asks for the only correct answer to be the mandible ossifies purely desmal, that is wrong. A concluding word on Meckel's cartilage. It is the first to appear, and due to its expansion movement, It is ultimately the trigger for the shearing forces that lead to the formation of bone, indeed to the formation of the mandible. It serves as an initial framework, and its rear end remains as the malleus, as one of the ossicles. And in front it is degraded. Before that, it always appeared so undulated and compressed on our reconstructions first. These are also indications of forces, aren't they? And then it is degraded and replaced by bone. We're not quite finished with Meckel's cartilage yet. It plays an important role during formation of the temporomandibular joint. The skull base is complicated. It consists of individual cartilaginous preforms of the bones, which then ossify from these preforms. We ourselves have not studied it in detail much, mainly because the boundaries of the individual cartilaginous preforms were not always as sharply defined as shown here in the diagram. And here we can summarize again which bones on the skull ossify chondraly. This is the base of the skull, and the bones shown here are in blue, and the shares of the visceral arches on the cartilage primordia are also shown here again, marked in dark blue. And what is shown in the ochre color, like this, that ossifies directly in a desmal way, as mentioned before. Now let us take a closer look at the alveolar process bone. This is where the teeth are inserted. Here in this beautiful whole mount preparation, nothing has been sectioned and digitally reassembled. Instead, the connective tissue has been made transparent with glycerin, and the bone has been stained red with alizarin, and the cartilage was stained with Alzian blue. And the spongy structure in the upper jaw and the denser bone structure in the lower jaw can be seen very clearly here. And both the upper jaw and the lower jaw are still separated in the middle. And you can see the sockets for the teeth very nicely. We had a basic question. How is this compartmentalization formed? I mean, how are the bony edges formed, which later, and perhaps already now, are called the alveolar crests? It could be, on one hand, that the dental primordia sink down into the bone. Thereby the crypt is hollowed out and degraded, and the edges remain. Or it is the other way around. The interdental bone could also be actively growing up between the dental primordia. So what do you think? How is it? I think this is exciting in a way, isn't it? To find out about it, we have done both now, histology and 3D reconstructions. So here again, as an example, dental primordia with their surrounding bone in a horizontal section, and next to it the corresponding 3D reconstruction made by one of our graduate students, Matthias Konieczny. And in addition, we analyzed the bone on its surface. Where there were a lot of osteoblasts, of course apposition of bone takes place, and we have marked that in red. And where the osteoclasts predominated, these are the bone resorption zones, and they were marked in green. And then everything was reassembled in 3D again. Here, a histological section is inserted into the reconstruction as an example. And now you can see the dental primordia, the central and the lateral incisors, the canine and the first molar in the mandibula in a medial view. And between the dental primordia, the bony ridges, the edges of the crypts in which the dental primordia are located. And between the canine and the first molar, a bony septum even protrudes high, really very high, and it is marked in red. So it is an active bone formation which rises up there between the dental primordia, just like building foam. I was surprised by that. I had not expected it to be so extreme. And well, you can also see some of the green zones where bone is being removed directly in the vicinity of the teeth, which are also becoming thicker. That is what I expected. But overall, the alveolar crest at that time is the result of very active bone apposition. We can also take another impressive look at this from an occlusal view, from above. First, only the right half of the mandible with the teeth inside in blue Meckel's cartilage and in yellow also the inferior alveolar nerve. And if we digitally remove the dental primordia and show the surface properties of the mandible, of that bone instead, then we see again very nicely the bony septa between the dental primordia are active formations. That is what we wanted to know. And the German Research Foundation, DFG, has supported this work for many years, which we have carried out with graduate students. And here are the reconstructions made by Camilla Zimmermann and by Felix Schuster. And to show you the proportions, here we have some reconstructions of the lower jaw, only the right halves again, viewed from above, shown in the same scale. So far left, the 10th week, to the far right, the situation in the 18th week. And the scale is inserted, the line at the bottom is 2 millimeters. And I would not like to withhold you another great research result from you. We had already mentioned that desmal bone formed directly from connective tissue develops in areas where shearing forces do occur. And this is the case for the mandible at the very beginning, next to Meckel's cartilage. And this also applies to the calvaria skull bones, which form in the gap space between the expanding brain and the overlying scalp skin, just also again under shearing forces. And here we have been able to investigate this for the first time on our mandibles. These are preparations from the mouse. And on the left side of the picture you can see the regions marked in red at the edge of the crypts and between the teeth. They grow and they expand and they generate shearing forces, as you can see on the right in the shear force analysis diagram. And these forces shine yellow and red. And as you can see now, the areas where we saw bone growth are exactly the same areas where shearing forces were detected in the computer simulation. The embryologist Erich Blechschmidt, who was the first so to recognize and describe this in his mechanical gene effects, would have been very happy about this further proof. We have made these investigations together with our colleagues at Bonn University, above all with the physicist Christoph Buraul. I find embryonic development really exciting, and the formation of muscles is also fascinating and perhaps perplexing, as you will see in a moment. You know, the orofacial muscles are the first to form in the human body, and with the early mesenchymal condensations of the muscles of facial expression, which have not yet arrived at their proper location. But they are becoming apparent at about the 8th to 9th week. And at about 14 weeks, they have reached their final position. Of the masticatory muscles, the mylohyoid and the genioglossus are the first to form, and thereafter the other muscles. The fetus can make lip movements from the 8th week and swallowing movements from the 12th weeks on. And there are 3 important steps of muscle formation. In the first step, mesenchymal cells migrate from the paraxial head mesoderm, which is from the back, into their later target area in the facial region. Here they form a pre-muscle mass, where in the second step then local differentiation into muscle cells takes place, and in the third step the definite position and the fiber direction in this then locally resident pre-muscle mesenchyme is determined. And thereby they are still under the influence of some signaling molecules. If these are missing, then there are no muscles being formed. At the same time, the nerves sprout into their extension area and meet the muscles, where they then integrate. The bellies of the muscles of mastication are located in the area of the trigeminal nerve, while the facial nerve spreads out in a flat area into the subcutaneous regions of the face, where it encounters the muscles of facial expression. I had said that earlier. It is exciting with the development of the muscles. One always thinks that the muscles must be arranged in such a way that they fulfill their function properly. So to say, they fulfill their purpose. But now we are back to the purpose discussion, and that is not the reason why the muscles form. We are looking again at the physiological processes. And here we see a small fetal skull, and next to it an adult skull. And you see some red arrows there. And these are the essential vectors of growth direction. And that is obvious. And in the third picture now, the same arrows, and also included now are the muscles. And see what is striking here. The fiber direction of the muscles corresponds exactly to the directions in which the underlying face has grown. This is not only true for the face, it's true for the whole body. This has been recognized by the embryologist Erich Blechschmidt again. The fiber directions of the muscles is created by stretching the myogenic mesenchyme. The muscle tissue is thus pulled apart during this formation, and when a nerve enters and sends an electric action potential, the muscle contracts again. The direction in which it can contract is exactly the reverse of how it has been formed. So the actions of the muscles are a consequence of their physiological conditions of formation that has nothing to do with the purpose for which we then practically use the muscles after birth. That is another fantastic insight, isn't it? The chewing movements are practical, but only because there has been just these geometrical developmental movement of the parts lying under the muscles. They have stretched the masseter vertically, and the temporalis so fan-shaped, and the buccinator so in a sagittal direction. Here we can also look at the perioral muscles in detail. The fiber direction of each muscle is at the same time also the indication of which growth and developmental movements have taken place at the time of their formation. It also follows that the muscles of facial expression ultimately develop at their proper location, here in the region of the face, where this also comes into function. I cannot understand how in some textbooks it is claimed that the muscles of facial expression would migrate from the area of the second visceral arch, which is at the neck, into the face, only because it is innervated by the facial nerve, which for reasons of biological systematics is assigned to the second visceral arch. So, purely anatomically, the facial nerve comes from the stylomastoid foramen and does not first move to the neck, but rather it bends anteriorly and moves in a fan-shaped pattern through the parotid gland and spreads out over the entire face. There are also some branches down to the neck, but only very small ones. So one reason I see for this error is that questions and topics on evolution, again, comparative anatomy and comparative embryology, are not clearly addressed separately. Just because the seventh cranial nerve, the facial nerve, which supplies the muscles of facial expression, comes out further down than the trigeminal nerve, the third branch of which innervates the masticatory muscles motorically, is concluded from this, from the point of view of evolution, that the muscles of facial expression must have migrated from dorsally into the facial region in the course of historical transition from species together with the associated motor nerves. From the evolutionary biological point of view, this may also seem conclusive if one assumes that lower species have no muscles of facial expression at all, and higher species develop more and more muscles of facial expression and social expressiveness. But as I have said, one is wrong to look for clues in the migration of myogenic mesenchymal cells to possible conservations of this historical process. In fact, muscles, and not only that of the second visceral arch, arise from mesenchymal cells that have migrated from the area of the paraxial mesoderm, that is, not from the cranial neural crest, and also not from the neck into the later target region. The tongue arises from portions of the first, second, and third visceral arch. The cells from which the muscles of the tongue develop have also again migrated from behind, the occipital myotomes. I have shown previously that the tongue is ultimately an elevation of the oral floor region of the common oronasal cavity. This was at the time when the epithelium, because of its tremendous growth and because it makes these folds, takes over the formative role in the early embryo. And here in these pictures, we are a few days later, and it is now about the composition, the shape, and about the innervation that results from 3 visceral arches. The base of the tongue arises in the area of the third visceral arch. This is also the area of the lingual tonsils. As a border, the terminal sulcus can be seen as a V-shaped line on the tongue lifelong. At the tip of this V, the foramen cecum is recognizable, which indicates that from here the thyroid gland has migrated cervically to its target area. And the path is still traceable as the thyroglossal duct. This is also such a fascinating aspect of development. At the beginning, the tongue surface is still very smooth. In embryos of 5 mm crown rump length, which is 4th to 5th week, individual cell elevations are recognizable as primordia of the filiform papilla, and larger papilla are visible in embryos of 80 mm crown rump length. This is the 11th week. The tongue primordium grows very fast. The enveloping epithelium grows and pulls the mesenchyme underneath into different directions. And therefore, in the 5th to the 7th week, the muscles of the tongue become visible as an intertwined arrangement which is interwoven in sagittal, transverse, and vertical directions. Portions of the tongue arising from the first visceral arch, the area anterior to the terminal sulcus, are innervated by the lingual nerve, that's from the trigeminal nerve. And involvement of the second visceral arch is via the chorda tympani, that's from the facial nerve. And the tongue area arising from the third pharyngeal arch is reached by the glossopharyngeal nerve, that's number 9. And we can repeat here again the change of place or the change of position of the tongue, which we have already seen in connection with the development of the palate. So the tongue has now become quite large, and initially it is positioned in the common oronasal cavity. The 2 palatal processes each lie lateral to the tongue, and only then, when the face becomes uprightened and the neck becomes longer, then the tongue is being pulled downwards, as you know. It is all attached to all of these cervical organs and tissues. And only then the palate can be closed and the tongue can find its place underneath of the palate, as we have seen that before in this lecture. The systematics of the 12 cranial nerves and their course is hard to learn and thus hard to get into your head. I want to refer here to the helpful scheme by the embryologist Jeffrey Sperber. From this, at least, there are clues to the complex, sometimes crossed assignments between the orofacial regions and the course of the cranial nerves. This is related to the very early, actually very well-ordered facial arrangement following the pattern of the very early face. But then, during further development, there are migrations and shifts in proportion of the organ systems, and with it, because the nerves do follow them, then to this arrangement. Maybe this scheme helps you a little bit. Normally, all joints in the body are formed by disjunction. So the limb, for example, first consists of one piece and then it bends and breaks, like when you bend a branch back and forth all the time, and then you also have a joint after some time. But there are some joints in the body that are formed by apposition. The sternoclavicular joint, the iliosacral joint, the intervertebral joints, and the temporomandibular joint. So in the 6th week, there is no temporomandibular joint yet. The mandible is initially only, as we have already seen, a flat bony plate lateral to Meckel's cartilage. And then in the 9th week, we see signs of a later condylar process. But there is already a joint, but another joint. The posterior end of Meckel's cartilage extends into the primordia of the auditory ossicles. Yes, the posterior end of Meckel's cartilage, that is indeed the primordium of the malleus. What is really going on in development of the temporomandibular joint has been investigated on thousands of individual histological sections and shown on many 3D reconstructions and studied with many doctoral students in our department. Currently, we are still dealing with a peculiar situation. Here you can see a human embryo from the 9th week. It already has all the important muscles and can already move its mouth. But it does not have a temporomandibular joint yet. Let's turn it to the side and remove the muscles. And then you see where we expect a temporomandibular joint, there is no joint yet. There's a big gap. The distance between the condyle, which is still growing, and the mandibular fossa, which does not yet exist, is still quite large, at least for an embryo. But it already moves its jaw, so it must have a joint. And yes, for this he uses the joint in the primordial area of the auditory ossicles. So the posterior end of Meckel's cartilage, the malleus, articulates with the incus. And this is the temporomandibular joint at that time. It works. You might wonder what it sounded like at that time, that is, if it made any noise or whatever. In some textbooks, this joint, which works provisionally as a jaw joint, is also called the primary jaw joint. And the real one, which comes later, then is called the secondary joint. This is also called the appositional joint, or an attachment joint. And more details about development will be addressed in the special lecture on the temporomandibular joint. So now we can come to the take-home message. We have seen that the forward bending of the facial region with the folding of and formation of the facial bulges is the condition for what will develop inside of these bulges. These pharyngeal arches, or also called visceral arches, are the result of this mechanics of early facial development. Important parts of the face emerge from these visceral arches. And we have also worked out the difference between the development of cleft lip and cleft palate. Cleft lips represented the separation of what was once before continuous. And a cleft palate occurs when the palatal processes cannot come together. And finally, we have touched the temporomandibular joint as an appositional joint. Here only briefly, we will discuss this in detail in the large chapter on the temporomandibular joint. And with this, I thank you for your kind attention.